Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Phil Wilson.
Question number one, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will join me in condemning the sickening murders in Syria of Japanese journalist Kenji Goto and the Jordanian pilot Lieutenant Moaz Al-Kasasbeh. I'm sure the thoughts and prayers of the whole House will be with their families at this very difficult time, and we should also think of our own pilots and their families and all those who serve. I can assure the House that we will not stop until the murderous ISIL extremists behind this and their poisonous ideology are eradicated. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Phil Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to associate myself with the comments that the Prime Minister has just made. Mr. Speaker, a constituent of mine, an agency worker, told me he only pays income tax if he works overtime. Part of his wages is paid in expenses, even when he's on holiday, affecting his NI contributions and therefore his benefit and pension entitlement. £16 a week is deducted from his wages to administer his payroll, and he even has to pay for his own payslip. Mr. Prime Minister, is this any way to treat hard-working people?
Well, first of all, I'd say we are looking at abuse by so-called umbrella companies that can sometimes bring these things about. But the broader point is I want to help people like that by cutting their taxes and taking them out of income tax altogether. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've taken 3 million of the lowest paid out of income tax altogether. With our plans that people should be able to earn £12,500 before they start paying income tax, that will take another 1 million people out of income tax altogether.
Mr. David Willits.
Will the Prime Minister welcome the increase in students applying for university, especially from the poorest backgrounds? Will he confirm that both universities and students would lose from the reduction in funding caused by a cut in fees? How could a policy that only helped rich graduates possibly be called progressive?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. The Coalition's university policy was a long-term policy that has resulted in a record number of students attending universities and also an increase in those from the poorest backgrounds going to university. It's good for our country, good for students and good for universities. And what a contrast with the party opposite, who 4 years ago told us that they were going to get rid of these tuition fees and 4 years later have got absolutely nothing to say about it at all. When are they going to make up their minds?
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I join the Prime Minister in condemning the appalling murders of the Jordanian pilot and the Japanese hostages by ISIL. These were sickening and despicable acts and simply reinforce our determination to defeat this evil organisation. Mr. Speaker, everyone pays stamp duty on stock market transactions except hedge funds, who are allowed to avoid it, costing many hundreds of millions of pounds. Why is the Prime Minister refusing to act on this?
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, for 13 years, during many of which he was in the Treasury, they did absolutely nothing about this. But what this government has done is more than any previous government to make sure that individuals and companies pay their taxes properly. But I have to say, I'm delighted he's raised the economy on the morning after his shadow chancellor couldn't name one single business leader who backed Labour.
Mr. Speaker, this is Prime Minister's questions, and he should try and answer the question. Now, I asked him a very specific question. About why hedge funds aren't paying stamp duty on stock market transactions. It's costing hundreds of millions of pounds. He's been funded to the tune of £47 million by the hedge funds. Everyone knows that's why he's refusing to act, but what is his explanation?
Let me just remind him, when we came to office, foreigners didn't pay stamp duty on the properties they bought. Foreigners didn't pay capital gains tax on the properties they bought. And because of his tax rates, city hedge fund managers were paying lower tax rates than the people who clean their offices. That's what we had to sort out. But let me put it to him again. The day after his shadow chancellor was asked on the television, could he think of one single business leader? And do you know what he said? Do you know what he said, Mr. Speaker? He said, Bill somebody. Mr. Speaker, Bill somebody's not a person. Bill somebody's Labour's policy.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell him what people on this side are doing. We're standing up for hard-working families and businesses while he's a friend of the tax avoiders. Now, I'm going to keep asking him the question until he answers it. It's a very specific question about hedge funds avoiding stamp duty on their share transactions. It's costing hundreds of millions of pounds. He's bankrolled by the hedge funds. He claims he wants to act on tax avoidance. Why won't he act?
If he's got a good submission for the budget, we can talk to the Chancellor about it. But he says what they're doing on his side of the House. Let me tell him what he's been doing on his side of the House. 2 former Labour health secretaries completely condemned his health policy. All the leading university vice-chancellors condemned his university policy. He can't find one single business leader to back his economic policy. Is it any wonder that the Chuckle brothers have lodged an official complaint and said they don't want to be compared to the 2 clowns opposite?
I'm afraid I'm going to keep asking the question until he has an answer. Right, now let me explain it. Let me explain it to him. You can't help him, George, you're too far away. Now let me explain it to him. Let me explain it to him very simply. Everybody pays stamp duty on their share transactions.
I apologise for interrupting. The questions and the answers will be heard. This is a democratic chamber, and no one is going to be shouted down. The point is very simple and very obvious, and I hope everyone can grasp it. Ed Miliband.
Well, let me explain it to him very simply. Everybody pays stamp duty on their share transactions, but the hedge funds are protected. We've been calling for action on this. It could raise hundreds of millions of pounds. Why won't he act?
We have acted on stamp duty. We'll continue to act on stamp duty. But he sat for 13 years in the Treasury and he never did anything about it. Now, if he wants to make sure that he acts on tax avoidance and evasion, why doesn't he start with Labour's biggest donor, Mr. John Mills? Yes, we all remember this, who gave his donation in shares in order to cut his tax bill. Has he paid back the taxes yet?
I'm really pleased he wants to talk about donors. Let's talk about his donors. 7 million...
Order! The question will be heard. It's a very simple point. I've had to make it a second time. I'll make it as many times as necessary. The right honourable gentleman will be heard. The right honourable member.
Talk about his donors, Mr. Speaker. £7 million from Lord Laidlaw, a tax exile living in Monaco. £3 million from Michael Hintz, company based in Jersey. And Michael Spencer, who gave him £4 million involved in the LIBOR scandal. Same old Tories. Now, let's give him the fifth chance. I know he doesn't do his homework. Fifth chance. The hedge funds are avoiding tax to the tune of hundreds of millions of pounds. Will he now promise from that dispatch box to act for the National Health Service?
We had Labour for 13 years, no action on stamp duty, foreigners not paying stamp duty, foreigners not paying capital gains tax, no bank levy, and he talks about tax exiles, Andrew Rosenfeld, the man who raises his money, was for years a tax exile living in Geneva. That's what we get. But isn't it any wonder he wants to find one particular issue to raise today, because he can't talk about minimum wages because his policy is to cut them. He can't talk about energy prices because his policy is to keep them up. He can't talk about universities because his policy is to trash them. He can't name a single business leader who supports Labour. No wonder the person who wrote "that things can only get better" says it no longer applies to Labour.
So basically, Mr. Speaker, he's been found out. 5 chances to answer the question, no answer coming. And let's close down that tax loophole so we can have more doctors, more nurses, more care workers, more midwives. This is the difference. This is a Prime Minister who won't tackle tax avoidance for the simple reason that too many of his friends would get caught in the net. They're the party of Mayfair hedge funds and Monaco tax avoiders. And under him, you always know it's one rule for those at the top and another rule for everyone else.
Mr. Speaker, there's only one person who's been found out this week, and that is the leader of the Labour Party. His economic policies collapsed, his health policies collapsed, his university policy is collapsed. The most vital election in a generation is coming, and people can see the choice. A Labour Party that is anti-enterprise, anti-business, that is falling apart under scrutiny, and a Conservative Party turning this country around. That is the choice. Competence from us, chaos from them.
Mr. Speaker, this week, Mr. Speaker, we have seen that fear is spreading across this land amongst senior business people. Will my right honourable friend reassure me that he will stay the course of his
order? The honourable gentleman's question must be heard. If he wants to continue the last bit of it, he can. Be heard. Spit it out.
Mr. Speaker, will my right honourable friend reassure me that he will stay the course to prosperity with his long-term economic plan?
We will stay the course because we can now see 1.75 million more people in work, the deficit down by half, the British economy growing faster than any major economy in Western Europe, and business and enterprise, large and small, saying we have the right plan and we should stick to that plan. That is what we'll do. It's competence versus chaos.
Susan Ellen Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They were elected by fewer than 15% of the public, and their first elections cost £80 million. Why won't the Prime Minister scrap these ridiculous police and crime commissioners and put the money instead into the sort of frontline policing that would keep our communities safe?
She might want to ask why her former colleague Alan Michael stood for one of these posts. I think it's bringing accountability to our police service, because everybody knows there is now one person that they have to account to. In the past, people didn't know how to access their police authorities. They do now.
Stuart Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When my right honourable friend visits Yorkshire tomorrow, he will be spoilt for choice of the number of businesses that are investing and creating jobs in Leeds, bringing unemployment in my Pudsey constituency down 55%, in Leeds West down 39%, and in Morley and Outward down 51%. Show that all parts of Leeds are contributing to the northern economic powerhouse thanks to this government's economic policy.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to explaining how our long-term economic plan will really benefit and continue to benefit Yorkshire and North East Lincolnshire. He's absolutely right. We've got employment up by 114,000 since the election. Private sector employment is almost up by 200,000 since the election. The Shadow Chancellor says, come to Morley and Outwood. Believe me, I'll be there. And I'm afraid to say, I have a plan to increase unemployment in that constituency by 1, to give him a bit more time to remember a single businessman that supports him.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Labour Party was in power for 13 years and failed to deliver a single additional power to Scotland that was outlined in the vow. The Conservatives and the Lib Dems have been in power for 5 years, and like Labour, they are not proposing the real home rule that was promised. Does the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party now understand why the voters of Scotland are sick of the Westminster parties, in contrast to the SNP that will always put Scotland first?
Well, what I'd say is this coalition government has actually taken part in a massive exercise of devolution to the Scottish Parliament and has already set out a significant extra increase in powers that will take place whoever is standing at this dispatch box after the election. And I have to say, yes, we have had a Westminster government here for the last 5 years. We have an SNP government in Scotland. And as the new Labour leader in Scotland has pointed out, under the SNP, any waiting times in Scotland are now worse than they are in England. So it's all right. Apparently it's all right to compare Scotland and England, but of course it's not all right to compare England and Wales. That's interesting, isn't it? I have to say it's a fascinating political strategy for the Scottish Labour leader to say that life is always better under the Tories, but I agree.
Adrian Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the success the Prime Minister claims for the coalition's long-term economic plan, why, if allowed to govern alone, does he want to change it to bring in even deeper cuts to public services?
Now, what I believe we need to do is to make sure that after 7 years of economic growth, which is what we will have had by 2018, we should be starting to pay down the deficit by running a surplus. And I think that is something that every business, every family in the country will understand. You need to fix the roof when the sun is shining. And as far as I can see, it is only the Conservative Party that will offer that at the next election.
Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Prime Minister comes to Yorkshire, he might reflect on the promise he made to a Barnsley business that he would support efforts to secure a major international contract to manufacture solar panels. Billions of pounds of investment depend upon him keeping his word, but delays in Whitehall mean that the deal is now at risk. So can I ask the Prime Minister to do what he said that he was going to do, to intervene, to make sure that we can bring hundreds of good, skilled jobs to this country?
No, well, I understand that UKTI, the Department of Energy and Climate Change and the Foreign Office have all been providing advice and support to Solar Europa in his constituency and have met with them on a number of occasions. We want to promote all projects that can create jobs in the UK and benefit relations with international partners. So I will look to see if there's anything that can be done in the Whitehall system that's getting in the way of this company, and I will write to the Honourable Gentleman.
Craig Whitaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Mohammed Naved Bashir, a constituent in the Calder Valley, was arrested in December. Despite pointing out on numerous occasions that he'd had a different name to the man they were wanting, they held him in the prison cells in Halifax for 3 days, and it was only confirmed that indeed they had arrested the wrong person when he was transported and presented to a judge in Glasgow. Will my right honourable friend ask the Home Secretary to look into this case and perhaps supply some answers to questions which Mr Bashir is not getting from the police?
No, well, I understand this does sound a very concerning case. My understanding is that West Yorkshire Police are investigating the circumstances surrounding the arrest and the detention of Mr Bashir. I can't give the House specifics of this case because it does involve ongoing legal action. I will discuss it with the Home Secretary as he asks, and of course one option would be for Mr Bashir Bashir to make a formal complaint to the Independent Police Complaints Commission. But let me try and get him some more information about that.
Joan Wally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the Prime Minister has followed closely the recent upheaval in the NHS in North Staffordshire, the Stafford and Stoke-on-Trent hospital mergers, the PET scanner, reasons for waiting times as accidents and emergency. But given that his government commissioned KPMG to produce the Staffordshire Distressed Economy report and it's being withheld, will he commit now to publishing the full report so that we can all see his real plans for the NHS in Stoke-on-Trent in North Staffordshire?
Well, I'll look very closely at the specific issue that the Honourable Lady asks. As she knows, continuing the safety of patients in Staffordshire is absolutely our main priority. I know that the University Hospitals of North Midlands NHS Trust are working hard with the Trust Development Authority and other parties involved to manage a safely and timely transition of services, and I think all parties should work together to do that. But I have to say, it is not helped by the Leader of the Opposition going to Stafford and deliberately scaremongering and trying to frighten local people. He has said, and I quote, he has said that Stafford Hospital is on the road to closure. This is what he means by weaponising the NHS. It is an absolutely disgraceful tactic. She knows it's not true. He knows it's not true, but he hasn't got the gumption to say so.
Margaret James.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister shares the gratitude expressed on all sides of the House for the sacrifices made by our healthcare professionals and armed forces, including my constituent, Lieutenant Mark White, for risking their lives to help the people of Sierra Leone combat the scourge of Ebola. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that a way should be found to recognise their bravery?
Absolutely. No, I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and I'm sure everyone would like me to put on my record praise for the incredibly brave people who've worked in very difficult conditions, including many of them over Christmas. These are, of course, doctors and nurses from our NHS, but also people from our armed forces, our civil service, and NGOs. They are the people, and they're helping to save thousands of lives in Africa and protecting the UK from the potentially disastrous consequences of the disease spreading. In recognition of the bravery of those from the UK, I intend to recommend to Her Majesty the Queen a new medal to pay tribute to their efforts. Details will be out in due course. This should be in place by the summer, and I think it's absolutely the right thing to say these people are incredibly brave and we owe them an immense debt of gratitude.
Kathy Jameson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's Green Budget from the Institute for Fiscal Studies shows that median wages were still almost 5% lower last year than they were in 2008. Will the Prime Minister now admit that families across the country are indeed facing a cost of living crisis?
What the Green Budget today shows, and I think we should take this as an important reference work, is that Labour would lead to an extra £170 billion of borrowing. That is the official figure. And yesterday, in another of his interventions, the Shadow Chancellor, who was busy yesterday, he said these words on Radio 2, Mr. Speaker: debt would be higher. The cat is out of the bag. It is official. Labour would borrow, tax, spend more, doing all the things to put us back into the mess we got out of.
Charlie Elphick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In recent weeks, Dover and East Kent have suffered gridlock due to problems at the Port of Dover and the fire in the Channel Tunnel. Will the Prime Minister support finding a long-term solution to this problem, a national strategic priority, and consider using lorry levy funds to help pay for it?
No, well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this question, and I know how hard he works for people in Dover and across East Kent. I understand that he met with my right honourable friend, the Roads Minister, the member for South Holland and the Deepings, about this, and as a result we've ordered an urgent review to look at the contingency arrangements for the M20A20 and for the M2A2 in the event of severe disruption at Eurotunnel and the Channel ports, taking account of the recent congestion. It is important that we learn the lessons from this incident, and if this report comes up with good suggestions, then obviously we'll look at them very, very carefully.
Steve Rotherham.
Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the Prime Minister said that if he failed to deliver on his promises, voters should kick him out. His promise on pointless reorganisations of the NHS, his promise on immigration in the tens of thousands, his promise to wipe out the deficit in this Parliament. Mr. Speaker, he has broken his contract with the British people. If he's a man of his word, there's a P45 with Cameron on it. He should take that lot and go.
I can tell him the commitments I made. I said we'd turn the British economy round. We have turned the economy round. I said we'd get the country back to work, 1.75 million more jobs. I said we'd get the deficit down by a half. I said we would protect the NHS, and we have protected the NHS. I said I'd look after Britain's pensioners. We kept our promise to pensioners, and I can tell him what the competition will be at the next election. Competence and a long-term plan on this side, chaos from the party opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, I visited the Cranswick pork facility in my constituency. It now employs 1,500 people at that site alone, hundreds more than in 2010. A lot of that investment came about because DEFRA ministers opened up the Chinese market, have kept it open. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister come and visit the facility, see the Northern Powerhouse in action, and see the effect of a long-term economic plan with exports at its heart?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight this. One of the most important manufacturing sectors in Britain, and indeed largest manufacturing sectors, is the food sector. It's very competitive. We need to do more to promote exports, and my right honourable friend, the Agriculture Secretary, is doing just that. The Chinese market represents an enormous opportunity. A number of important trade missions have already been carried out there, but we are also pushing within Europe for a free trade agreement with China. I think other countries, including New Zealand, have shown the massive amount of benefit that can bring to your country, and Britain will always be at the forefront of arguing for these trade agreements.
Tom Blenkinsop.
Does the Prime Minister know of anyone who owns or works for a UK-registered company that uses a Luxembourg-based holding company in order to avoid paying their fair share of tax in the UK?
Well, I want to see more and more companies headquartered here in the United Kingdom, and that's exactly, under this government, what is happening. We inherited a situation where company after company was leaving our shores. Because we've now got competitive tax rates and a business-friendly government, more and more businesses are coming here, including in his constituency.
Greg Mulholland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, 6-year-old Sam Brown from my constituency with 10-year-old Kamal from London came to see the Prime Minister to deliver personal letters to him about the NHS England failure to come up with a process to allow the NHS to fund the drugs they need for Morquio syndrome, which also applies for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. NHS England are still dragging their heels. Could the Prime Minister, who I know has taken an interest in this, please intervene to come up with an interim solution so all these children can get the drugs that they need?
Well, I well remember meeting the honourable gentleman and also the young boy who came with Duchenne muscular dystrophy syndrome. I have looked at this. The consultation is now underway and will finish at the end of April. And following this, the NHS will make a decision as quickly as possible of whether or not to routinely fund Translana. I've discussed this with the Health Secretary and we'll do everything we can to help.
David Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the government withdrew £80 million from 5 schools in my constituency. This destabilised the school in the village of Wrighton so much it's being forced against the will of all concerned to become an academy, and the curriculum has been constantly cut and dedicated staff lost their jobs, and there's more of the same to come in the summer. What do I tell my constituent Lauren White, who loves this school, when she's seeing her chosen career disappear before her very eyes?
Well, all the evidence is that schools that have converted into academy status have seen their standards improve at a faster rate than maintained schools. Isn't it interesting, Mr. Speaker, that the party that started to promote academies has given up on that good reform as well as the other reforms they've given up on? We put extra money in for school places, we're seeing improvements in school standards, and we've said that any schools that are either inadequate or require improvement will need to be taken over by an academy if they don't have a proper plan for improvement. That is something that I think all parents who want to see their children succeed at school will welcome.
Mike Freer.
Speaker. My right honourable friend has been admirably robust at combating anti-Semitism, and this government have been generous in supporting security measures at state faith schools. However, there are 120 community buildings now at risk of terrorist attack, the type we saw in Paris. Will my right honourable friend commit to looking at creating a counter-terrorism fund to help meeting the security measures at these community buildings?
No, I think my honourable friend makes a very important point. I have met with the Jewish Leadership Council and discussed this issue in the light of the Paris attacks. As he knows, the school security grant, which we introduced, has made available £2.3 million of funding in the current year to protect security at Jewish schools, and it will be maintained next year. The Education Secretary is also going to meet with the Community Security Trust and see if we can do more to help Jewish independent schools. In my view, we need to do everything we can to help this community feel safe and secure in our country. I would hate it for British Jews not to feel that they have a home here in Britain, safe, secure, a vital part of our community.
Mark Durkan.
It is now 2 years since meningitis B vaccine was licensed for use across the EU. To achieve its effect of being able to prevent over 80% of meningitis B cases here, it needs to be on the routine immunisation schedule for the NHS. The Prime Minister sounded hopeful in the House in November. Can he give us some indication as to when there will be a conclusion to the negotiations between the government and Novartis?
Well, I'm afraid I can't give an update any further. The discussions are still underway. As he knows, this would be a vital step forward because of the horrors of this disease, but he also knows there are huge cost issues in making sure if we were to make sure this was made available. So those discussions with the drug company are vital, they're ongoing, and if I can give him an update in a letter, I will do so.
Jesse Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the whole of Herefordshire is behind a transformative project to create a new university specialising in engineering and technology, and in particular in the agri-technology, defence and security sectors. This is only possible because of the government's universities policy and its decision to lift the cap on student numbers. Will the Prime Minister look hard with the Chancellor at the potential to award some public capital funding to support this enormously worthwhile project?
Well, I think my honourable friend is right that uncapping university numbers removes the cap on aspiration, and we want to have a country where everyone can have the choice of an apprenticeship or a university place. He's right that some areas of our country, including Herefordshire, have been underserved by university provision, and that's why we've got the extra £200 million available in the Higher Education Funding Council for England to support STEM capital investment. I know that he's discussing with the Chancellor to see whether we could make available some of this funding for the scheme that he talks about. But I would say, Mr. Speaker, how important it is that we maintain a long-term plan for funding our universities. Young people in Britain want to know that we've got the best universities in Europe, and they'll continue to be that way. And that's why what the university vice-chancellors have said this week about how our plans are working and are costed, and Labour's plans are completely unworking and uncosted, is so important.
MM Morris.
Last night, the Prime Minister was on television and he said he would crack down on firms who move abroad to avoid paying their tax. So my question is this. When the government launched the taxpayer-backed National Loan Guarantee Scheme in 2012, why did the Prime Minister decide to allow companies based offshore in offshore tax havens to apply for this form of state aid?
The National Loan Guarantee Scheme was run by the banks, and it was the banks that chose what companies to fund. But let me say this, we have done more than any previous government to make sure that companies pay their taxes. We inherited a situation under Labour where foreigners weren't paying stamp duty, where companies were leaving Britain, where we were giving knighthoods to bankers that had failed Britain. All of that's changed.
Marie Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week is the anniversary of the Great Storm which ripped up the railway line at Dawlish in my constituency. I thank the Prime Minister and Network Rail for their very fast action to restore the line. Can he confirm his ongoing commitment to the South West Railway and the future funding for it?
Well, first of all, let me join my honourable friend in paying tribute to the Orange Army that did such a fantastic job at Dawlish in getting that line back on track in such a short period of time. As she knows, we've also committed a further 30 million towards resilience and protection this year. But more importantly, we are working with the South West Peninsula Rail Task Force to bring together all the strategic and local transport schemes. I'm absolutely determined that the southwest of our country will have a strong, whether it is road or rail or air connections with the rest of the country. These are absolutely vital to our long-term plan.
Order.